All right, so sorry. That was one of those moments where I needed to step away for just a second. Okay, moving back. But what I was saying was that we're going to talk a little bit more when we get further into this particular um, module, and we're going to talk about, especially this chapter, talk about like how the Hispanic population and why that one tends to be different, and why immigrants tend to be different than maybe Mexican born or Mexican Americans born in the US, right? And so these are going to be different categories and they're going to have different cultural factors. They're also going to have different resources. They're going to have different access. And we're going to see different things in that nature. So, and we'll get into that. You're going to see a lot more preventable hospitalizations. And again, that's because who's going to, people of color are far more likely, essentially, to be in economic, um, lower economic uh, categories. And with that comes a lack of access to healthcare. And with that, along with the harms and the history of medical harms that been done in this country, that leaves a very essentially um, perfect storm that comes together that leaves people not wanting to go to the doctor, not able to go to the doctor, not able to get the preventative care that you need, that would stop some of a large majority of the hospitalizations. Now, that's not to say that everybody can, that any of those things might not have still continued to get worse, right? Or you might not have ended up with pneumonia anyway, or what have you, even if you do see the doctor and get the Z-Pack or what have you when you have the bronchitis, right? Um, or so like that's not to say that we can definitively say that any of these situations might not have still led to hospitalization just due to the like due to how a human will react to any specific virus or illness in general. But it is to say that many of these things would have had preventative measures that could have taken place that didn't due to all of these other social factors. Um, so again, we talked about access to healthcare and poverty rates. Black persons are 9 times more likely to die of AIDS than white people. And that again comes down to these preventative care measures and comes down to access to care. And also the ability to have conversations surrounding certain social topics. Um, Indigenous person and Hispanic persons are about twice as likely as white persons to die of AIDS. And again, this comes from generational understandings of the AIDS epidemic. I used to be an HIV/AIDS educator when I was in high school in the early 2000s, and went on to work with the Red Cross in that particular forefront for a good while. And so I remember the stereotypes that came with it, the lack of specific demographics wanting to even talk about the possibilities. And most of that stemmed from the idea that they didn't want to be lumped into one of these categories because they were already struggling with social interactions. They are social interactions, social biases, and they didn't really want to add on to that. And what that does is the longer you leave the HIV infection without being treated, the more likely you are to get into a system or get into problems or for it to go ahead and start having those immune deficiency issues and then end up with this process that you can't necessarily um, treat in the same way. And that leaves it far more deadly. Indigenous persons and Black persons are about twice as likely to die from diabetes than white people. Again, we're going to talk about some of the systemic reasons that that is, but primarily the justification there or the rationale for this particular stat is comes down to diet and dietary options. And we're going to get into how the social, how those things are really connected to this particular outcome. There's been a wide discussion about COVID disparities and the difference in between the public and private healthcare systems when it came to treatment. There were really good studies done on vaccine hesitancy in demographics of color. You saw a lot of um, disparities correspond with that. However, Indigenous people were much more likely to get COVID or to die from COVID. However, their vaccine rates were significantly better than some of the other demographics. And a lot of the rationale for that difference is really, again, access to specific kinds of healthcare once someone did get sick. So it wasn't necessarily that they weren't doing the preventative measures. It was a dependency on who had access to these measures and also what happened prior to, say, the vaccines coming out or like some of the newer treatment options. All right. And so there was, again, these come back to the same situations. And when you see pandemics or you see any kind of situation similar to that, there's almost always going to be disparities depending on what group or demographics you're talking about. So they talked in the latter half of the chapter, they talked about low birth rate in babies and how and why people of color or women of color might have babies that are have much lower birth rates. And again, that's going to fall into some of these more systemic social issues that stem from opportunities or options for dietary change. It's going to stem from things like other kinds of pollutions, other kinds of toxins. And we're going to get into what I mean by a food desert, the water contaminations, the pollutions. We're going to talk about all these things when we get into that environmental racism area. We're also going to talk about that in connection to, because when you have a food desert, essentially what that means is that you don't, or you lack options for better, healthier foods. So you're going to have less fresh produce, less fresh meats. You're going to do a lot more, you're going to see a lot more fast foods. You're going to see a lot more canned goods. You're going to see a lot more ramen, right? These are the things that are going to be associated with either A, not being able to afford some of those options, and B, because groceries are astronomically expensive. And well, at least they are right now. They may not always be. But also that there's not the access to be able to possibly make your own or be sustainable in a way that you could even plant a garden or have the space to do that, right? So if you're in specific parts of cities, especially super urban areas, you're going to see like corner stores that are going to have some things, but they're not going to necessarily carry like the full range of products that most of us in Kentucky would, where you guys go to school, would be able to access, right? Because they're not going to have even the rural area like mom and pop kind of shops, right? You're going to see a lot less fresh produce. You're going to see a lot less, if any, probably limited, if any, farmers markets, because that's just not what's in the area. And you're just not going to see a lot of big grocery stores. You're not going to see a lot of chains, and those don't happen in particularly urban areas or neighborhoods that have people of color. You're going to see them go to the richer neighborhoods. You're going to see them go to the primarily white neighborhoods. And that's intentional, right? And it has been intentional, and it's been part of city planning and been part of business models to stay out of those areas. But what that does is leave these food deserts for people who live in these areas where they don't have access to very good, healthy choices, even if they wanted them. And that leads to higher risks of diabetes. That leads to higher risk of obesity. That leads to higher risk of a plethora of health and wellness options. All right. So you also ends up having a lot of issues when it comes to, speaking of okay. So a lot of the lifeways that come into Indigenous practice, or even in some of your rural areas or some of your southern areas, they had a lot of subsistence. I do not know why that is such a hard word for me to say this evening, but it is. Farming. And so you're going to have even like your plot, your neighborhood plot you might have, or you might have your backyard might have a pretty substantial garden in it, or you might grow things on your land, or as a community, you guys might grow things. And these lifeways, colonial forces really limited and pushed indigenous people into areas where those kind of living lifeways and those kinds of traditions weren't allowed to be upheld. And that if even if they were, when they realized the land was fertile, then those colonial bodies would generally take or make policies in order to maintain ownership of whatever is grown there, right? So that those indigenous persons were left with little autonomy over the food choices that they had. And this matters, right? Because this ends up having long-term health implications. On top of that, you're going to see that again in very southern states where there was a lot more post the abolition of slavery, abolishment of slavery. You're going to see uh, a lot of former slaves that would go and end up trying to figure out or work land or have little small communities together that would be housed together and try to work the land because that's what they were doing. And so doing that in a way that worked and it provided for themselves and their family, and or working on farms where they would be paid or possibly treated better or had no other option but to work for people who had really harsh working conditions. All of these things still allotted a different level of food options than maybe some of the options that are available now. Plus, the food options from almost any other era in history had less water toxins, had less steroids pumped into them, had less toxins just in the ground system altogether. So that in and of itself made food specifically more healthy, and those have had long-term health implications for all humans. But specifically, you are more likely to have those health implications and have higher toxicity rates if you are a person of color in this country or in any other. All right. Let's see. So there's also, again, we talked a lot about doctors' assumptions and a lot about the medical implications of a broken system back in one of the earlier chapters. But if you want to go over that again, please let me know. And then they also talked about a little bit in the back half of the chapter, asthma in youth, and that's going to be towards a lot of things. That's going to be, again, one of the last organs to form in the womb is your lungs. So if you have low birth rate or you're born premature or have any kind of complications, those are usually the lungs are where, and breathing is where you see those complications. On top of that, you also end up with asthma due to toxic airways, like any kind of what else? Just hazards in the health altogether. But again, the lungs are still forming throughout most of childhood, and so you're really looking to see again how much environmental factors come into play due to the area you live in and what relationally is there. All right, fair warning, these topics are really hard, and the level to which it existed and still to an extent exists is mind-boggling and really horrific. Our scientific history, especially medical science, has a long history of experimentation, non-consensual experimentation on people of color, especially slaves and women of color. These three women down here are Dr. Sims, who is considered the forefather of modern gynecology, was one of the most horrific people on records, and he essentially would do experimentation on slaves regarding care regarding partum, regarding any kind of ovarian issues, any kind of like hysterectomies, things of that nature. But he also did these things with no anesthetics, intentionally, because he had false assumptions that women of color could not feel pain in the same way, or people of color in general could not feel pain in the same way. He had several doctors that worked with him, that left because they were forced to hold down these women, while they screamed out in pain. And then that left the women to have to hold each other down, which was highly traumatic. And just the overall practices of this particular human, despite the fact that they continue to cite him, continue to talk about his work, continue to revere him as this forefather of an entire field. The really horrific history sometimes takes a back burner to what they say he has accomplished. And while I have no doubt there was a lot that was learned, the ways in which he did it should take precedence and should matter far more. As doctors, there is an ethical code to do no harm, and that's not the case for a vast majority of early doctors and still some medical science today. Henrietta Lacks, if you do not know who this is, this woman right here, her cells had a regenerative property that allowed them to essentially, they were called the immortal cells because they would essentially recreate despite being out of the host. And because of that, her cells have given us a lot of, been the basis for a lot of medical breakthroughs, a lot of vaccine breakthroughs, a lot of like crap tons of medical studies are still done on this woman's cells. They are still recreating those cells. They are still using those. Her family receives nothing for them. She received nothing for them. They took them without her consent. And this is something that is still widely chalked up to, well, she's no longer here and the benefit outweighs not using these cells. But there's really, really big ethical concerns that come into that. And so that's something that I think that we need to, hold on just 1 second. Okay, sorry. So that is something that we need to really pay attention as we are going into fields that are STEM sciences, as we move forward in the world, paying attention to when we start getting into genetics, and we really start as a civilization working towards having conversations about genetics. We need to make sure that we understand how our own biology is being used, who gets to take ownership of it, why that matters, and our long history of utilizing non-consensual practices in order to maintain ownership of parts of us, right? You also had a lot of experimental medical science done on Indigenous children in U.S. schools. Some of the bodies that have been uncovered in the Canada school system, as well as the U.S. system, have been attributed to certain medical experimentation. That's down in Texas. Okay. You also have, and part of that again goes back to that mass grave that they found under the Medical College of Georgia, where there's a long history of stealing bodies from African American cemeteries, and they were used as cadavers in the medical school so that they could do experimentation. So they would exhume these bodies from their resting place and essentially use them as cadavers and do experiments on these bodies without the consent of the families, without even knowledge that they were doing this. And they were using slaves to dig these bodies up. You also have things like Dr. Hamilton, who did the skin experiment. So they would continue to dig into people to talk through essentially whether or not there was a layer of white skin underneath the darker skin, and really unethical, um, just the unethical principles that warranted that science to begin with is gross. But then on top of that, talking about the ways in which those experiments then led to further processes of non-consensual harm. Um, yeah, the Tus- Tuskegee, there we go, experiment. And that was essentially a syphilis experiment that was done um, on men in, I believe that was in Georgia too. Um, and essentially they were African American men and some women, but mostly men, that were tested for a long-term study of essentially whether or not um, a treatment was working for syphilis. And essentially they gave some the medicine and some without, but they told them all that they were treating them, and then essentially just figured out where the health, or what the health implications were. And so essentially people died from lack of treatment that they thought they were getting, and they continued to spread it on to their family members and to their spouses, to their children, who then also had health ramifications. This led to a really, really big turning point and medical research, because it led to a number of lawsuits and a number of um, new policies, so that they could kind of go in and figure out better ways to do medical research that did not cause these really big harmful um, problems. Um, so you also had um, last name Cade. I can't remember his first name. And the non-consensual treatments that they did, are not even treatments. They did an experiment on this man because he had been in contact with toxic pollution and they thought he was dying. So they went ahead and injected him non-consensually with plutonium to kind of see essentially how these massive amounts of radiation in his system did, because they wanted to know these more long-term impacts, but they didn't have the science to really way to do this another way. Now they weren't really looking for other ways or better options. They just kind of wanted the easy way, and this is what it was. There's a long history of forced sterilization. I do an entire lecture on this for my women and gender studies course. But Indigenous women, in such overwhelming numbers, would go in to have one baby and would be medically sterilized before they, without their consent. This happened for to slaves. This also happened to women of color for an extended period of time in this country. Sterilization also happened a lot within the eugenics movement for a wide variety of reasons, whether that could be something like race, but it could also be something like disability. It could be also something like having any kind of medical ailment, um, whether preventable or whether by accident or not. So it there was a lot of fostering what was decided to be okay to have children and who was not, and the sterilization process that happened left rendered a lot of women lacking the autonomy to make those choices themselves. um Again, also there was a large period of time all the way up until, I'm not going to say because it depends on the state. Um, but there's a long history of men being able to make that decision for their wife, for their young daughters, for their sisters, etc. Because women were considered incapable of making those choices at a societal level for an extended period of time. Whether or not that is accurate is less important than whether or not the society deemed men as dominant and allowed to make these decisions. And that's kind of where that happens. It's not to say that women couldn't have made these decisions at any point. It was whether or not they were allowed to, given the cultural and societal norms and practices. They also, again, sterilized a large portion of people with mental health diagnosis. They still sterilize prisoners. This is something that can happen to reduce sentence. They will throw that on the table, especially for drug charges for women, will lessen your sentence, and you'll get out of here faster if you agree to have a certain procedure or get an implanted birth control, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There is still a long-term history of experimentation on prisoners as well. Even the one that is over by, what's the name of that area? The prison that's in Lexington, that's right outside city limits over by Masterson Station. That particular prison has a history of prisoner experimentation. So you can learn more about that if you want. Or I'll get you some resources on that if you're interested. There's also a lot of sterilization of women in deportation centers. Again, that practice is supposedly not happening anymore. However, there's been reports of that still being part of the process. There's also, again, a long history of sterilizing women in lower economic brackets or lower educational brackets that may or may not understand what they were signing at any given point in historical period. Medical segregation is also leads to health inequalities, and that comes down to where you reside impacts your education, opportunities. It impacts how healthy the environments are that you live in. It impacts your food options, whether or not you have safe places to exercise, whether or not there are more advertisements for tobacco and alcohol, higher rates of violent crime, and just less resources overall when it comes to medical needs. So all of these things can be severely impacted by where you live. All right, let's keep going. So when we talk about health inequalities, your book talked about individual racism and kind of its impact on health. So I want to be very clear. Racism itself is handled differently depending on who you are, the support you have, the community-based resources you have. All of these things can impact the amount of stress that it causes, the amount of trauma, the amount of impact, right? That is not to say that people of color cannot experience these things. It's to say that not every person of color is going to experience these things in a similar way, and that it's going to be individualized how an individual handles their trauma, what that leads to in terms of mental health, what that leads to in terms of trauma responses, in terms of all sorts of lasting impacts, right? But high levels of stress can cause a host of mental and physical ailments, and that is something that they talked about pretty heavily in the book. Black youth are much more likely to experience traumatic events related to violence within their neighborhoods and within their life course than white persons and other persons of color. Indigenous youth are much more likely to experience the generational trauma related to colonialism and related to having parents who might have gone through, or grandparents that might have gone through boarding schools. And we're going to get into that pretty in depth when we talk about one of the articles. All right. These moments can also foster resilience, resistance, and they can have higher self-esteem just due to the fact that these are issues that unfortunately these individuals may see on a regular basis. All right, I'm going to stop here, and then we're going to get into these 3 different perspectives, and I will come back with that.